Hi, everyone. My name is George Valdes. I am your host here and also the head of marketing here at Monograph. First up, we have a panel with AIAS members. For those that may need a reminder, AIAS stands for American Institute of Architects Students Organization. And I'm sure we'll learn more about that through the conversation, but we're going to be having a conversation on practice operations. So what does that mean? People, performance, productivity, and what from this, especially from this perspective of coming out of school, right? I mean, this is kind of like the future generation that's going to be leading us in the industry, and it's really great to sort of understand like what are their concerns and how are they looking at their own career trajectory. So I'm delighted to introduce Scott Cornelius, president of AIAS, Shannon DeFranza, vice president of AIAS, Carrie Essery, a member of AIAS Professional Development Advisory Group, and Nicholas Romero, an emerging leader from GSBS Architects, who served as the West Quad Director on the AIAS Board of Directors today. And we heard from a lot of interesting leaders that talked about autonomy, transparency, trust, investing in potential. These were all themes around how to find people that are going to lead practice in the future. And so I couldn't be more thrilled to welcome these four members of AIS. Scott, Shannon, Carrie, Nicholas, welcome to the Section Cut stage.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start off maybe just from if you can kind of like maybe let us know where you are at in your career a little bit. And Shannon, it'd be great to kind of start off with you just so people have the context. Are you in school right now? Are you out of school? And that can kind of set the stage for like where we all are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am currently working for the American Institute of Architecture students. We're a nonprofit organization to help empower students, and Scott and I are full-time staff. So I graduated last year, last May, from Roger Williams University in Rhode Island. And so I am an emerging professional, I guess you could say, but I am not currently practicing architecture. That will be in the next few months.
Carrie.
Hi there, Carrie Essery. I graduated this past year with a Bachelor of Architecture degree from the University of Tennessee, and I'm currently studying landscape architecture and getting my master's degree in that.
Nice. Nicholas.
Hi. So I just graduated with my Master's of Architecture back in May of last year, and I've been working at GSBS Architects. Yeah.
And round us out, Scott.
Yeah, absolutely. So I graduated with my Bachelor's of Architecture from Oklahoma State University in May. And like Shannon said, the AIS has a pretty unique structure. So her and I are serving as full-time staff while we're officers of the organization.
So while some of you are kind of now more working in the institutional side of the industry, and some of you are in practice, I'd love to understand a bit about what your own, whether it's from the perception of AIAS, from the perspective of AIAS, how does operations, or just like the idea of starting firms in practice, how does that impact the organization? Is it a topic that's discussed? Like, what are the main aims right now for the organization as a whole?
Yeah, so I can start out with this. So the major focuses of the AIS, like Shannon was saying, are to empower and to advocate for architecture students and all the things that architecture students need to know to be, like you're saying, professional architects that are well-rounded and are able to do their jobs well, but also just to be well-rounded people in general. So we do a lot of advocating on work-life balance and all those types of things, but also within architectural education and architectural curricula itself, we definitely focus a lot on the balance between design teaching and technical teaching of architecture. We talk a lot about the mixture of those two things is what makes architecture. Architecture isn't just art, and it's not just a science. So yeah, we discuss a lot we use the word gaps in architectural education. What are the gaps in architectural education? How can we fill those in an organizational sense instead of in an academic sense? So we do quite a few, seminars and sessions and things, both within and without of our AIS conferences, that focus on skills that students need to know to be, again, successful designers. So some of those things are softer skills and more design focused, like sketching workshops and understanding design in a wider sense, but then we get into the more detailed things like being able to have software seminars focusing on Revit and Grasshopper and all these things that are developing in the industry. So that we definitely try to maintain a balance between those things, because people come to architecture for different reasons. People leave architecture for different reasons. And we want to make sure that these students have as many pathways to success as they need, if that makes sense.
And for work-life balance, what are the kind of issues? I mean, work-life balance back when I was in school, it wasn't necessarily the incentive structure of school wasn't necessarily lined up for work-life balance. And so it's great to hear that that's, something that AIAS is advocating for. How does that come down to, like practically, what are the kind of the tips and tricks, or, how is that being communicated to students today?
Shannon, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the educational level, we find that the practices you put for yourself when you're in school still, they really transfer over to when you're in practice. And so something that the AIS has is what we call our model learning and teaching culture policy. And it's kind of a template agreement that we really advocate for students to use at their schools to improve their studio or learning and teaching culture. To ensure that people are getting enough sleep, being healthy, taking care of their mental health, and actually valuing that. So time management is something we focus on. Valuing yourself and the fact that you are more than a grade is something that I think students really need to learn, because not everybody thinks that way. And so I would say those are some of the things we find students struggle with the most. And then if they're empowered to improve on what they're doing in education, they can bring that into practice and also identify, once they are in practice, unhealthy practices to then bring up, or hopefully they're empowered enough to bring up at their firm to say, hey, I don't want to be working 3 hours of overtime without getting paid for it and stuff like that. So those are some of the conversations that we've been having, and we're hoping that students are able to set boundaries for themselves earlier on in their career and then bring it along for the rest of it.
That's amazing. I mean, I get the sense that generationally speaking, you're also the attitudes and the kind of perspective. My hunch is just fundamentally different than, let's say, what even the industry yet knows, right? Like one case in point is like, I love to hear from your thoughts about this. Is like, do you feel that the reality in which you live meets the sort of expectations that you'll come to once you work in practice? In other words, like, just think about like how you consume information today. It's something we talk about a lot in Monograph. Like, some people might look at TikTok and say things like, "Oh, that's that's not really a viable place to communicate or whatever," right? But the feeling is that there's so many different changes that have happened in how people communicate, how they work together, how they collaborate, how they learn, that are very different from like even how traditional practice is set up. In other words, like I'd love to hear more about how has like even learning changed, right? Or like how is even learning different today in school when you have things like YouTube and all these other ways to kind of like share information. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. And Carrie, I'd love to hear yours first.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you're certainly alluding to, the ways we've been learning have changed. And just to give some perspective, within my 5 years of architecture school, my cohort started with drafting boards, and we did a bunch of hand sketching and learning how to like accurately draft with scales and everything. And then of course, graduating now, we're researching robotics, 3D printing, advanced fabrication, and all of this stuff that we're seeing is being implemented in the construction industry. So that definitely changes how we're learning generally, and then also about practice. And I would say generally that the good changes in our industry, and especially in education, are that it's becoming a lot more accessible. There's a recognition that there are a lot of ways to learn. And so I think professors are really tapping into that and trying to teach in different modes so that everyone has, a fair shot at learning in the way that best works for them.
Anyone else care to jump in on that?
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback on that for a second. I love what Carrie said right at the end, kind of speaking to more individual learning experiences. And I think people who are interested in developing new methods of curricula and things like that have been talking a lot about individualizing the learning experience as opposed to, standardized tests, those kind of things. I think we all are generally agreed now that those don't work as well as we thought they did once for assessing how intelligent someone is or how many skills they actually have. So, and I also love, George, that you mentioned YouTube. That I think that speaks a lot to the different ways that we learn now and what's available to us. So like Carrie said, when I started architecture school, our first projects were hand drafted, and that was kind of the expectation. And then, I went on to take a Rhino class and then went on to take a Revit class. And by the time I was a fifth year and about to graduate, these first years were coming in and were not only not doing hand drafting anymore, they were expected to learn Rhino on their own. They didn't have a Rhino class. They were like, here's a good YouTube playlist, learn Rhino. So that both contributes to what Carrie said. This education is much more accessible now and it's becoming more individualized, but we also need to make sure that we're not just throwing these resources at students and saying, okay, it's time for you to learn this. It needs to be made more individual per student. If someone can't learn that way, then it's a YouTube playlist won't work for them. So in some ways we're developing really fast and making education a lot more accessible and individual. In some ways we need to pull back a bit and say, okay, how can we use these resources effectively? Are all students learning in the same way? That kind of thing. But it is a really exciting time for education and we need to develop architectural curricula using the resources we have now and not the resources that we had, 50 years ago when your goal was to be a star architect and out there on your own.
Anyone else jump in?
Yes, I do. And I think something that I've noticed now is that not all schools' curriculum is the same. So at the University of Mexico, we start off with learning how to hand draft some things and whatnot. But once you move past just the initial process of starting off in the program, programs like Revit is kind of more or less frowned upon, and I guess into the design aspect of it. And Rhino is pushed to the very top. It's the most interesting program that can do the most things for you. But when you leave school, like I have, we don't use Rhino. I mean, we've tried to start using it in different aspects of things, but Revit's pushed all the way. And so there's a bit of a learning curve that kind of happens. And I would say even now going into the profession, a lot of YouTube has had to be done to figure out how to do various things on Revit. And so this 1 year of being out of school has been just a massive learning curve.
Yeah, and I guess I'll round it out for the four of us. Something that goes off of that is, I guess, that shift between when you're in school and you're really focused on learning how to think, how to be creative, and then you're pushed into the field and they're like, okay, produce profit for us. And so that's kind of the difference between a lot of the software we use, and then it's like a slap in the face, like, hello, okay, go do what you need to do and help us. So that's something. And to go off the points that Carrie and Scott also made about the personalized kind of experience and the ability to use YouTube to learn things. I had a course that was what it was to learn Rhino and a little bit of CAD. And that really worked for me. I don't know if I would be able to use YouTube to learn all of that stuff. However, then it was expected to do that. I was expected to do that in later years. I think the problem with that is students have such little time already to get everything they need to get done, and to then be expected to learn the programs outside of class time. That's basically like adding another course that they're not paying for. So then what are we paying professors for to teach us if we're trying to get these programs in our heads so we are able to market ourselves in the future? Not that we just want to be a marketable kind of profit making thing for firms, but that is something that I think I personally struggle with. And then the last thing I was going to say to your question on this in this area is just that how things maybe aren't matching up between education and the profession and the world. So all three of those aren't really meshing right now, in my opinion. And I think the biggest denominator of that is time. Because we're the ones that have been told since we were like 5, like, you're going to be the ones to fix everything. Okay. But we're not being taught how to fix climate change, for example. Oh yeah, just fix it. You'll be ready. But we're being taught with methods from 50 years ago, as Scott said. And then we get into the profession and we're led by firms that aren't equipped to make changes and stuff like that. So there's a big disconnect. And the whole thing, I think it comes down to, as I said, is time, because time for the world is moving so quickly on all of these big issues, but we're not ready in the profession or education, it seems, to make those changes. Or we are ready, people just don't know how or aren't taking the steps to do it.
That was wonderful. I mean, I feel like there's so much to unpack there. One, this time and change are kind of like two words that stood out to me on that front. It's like, if I were to ask probably about time management in general, or prioritization in general, it's probably, a lot of different answers on that front. But what you underscored too about change and how it's like, to the three different elements that you described, right? It's like it's student life, working in the profession, and then the world. The iterative cycles of the world right now are changing so much faster than even what practice can keep up with. And it's like there's a mindset shift that also needs to happen. It's the acceptance that, in reality, change is a constant. That also means that education is a constant. You can't stay fixed, because the moment you stay fixed, you become irrelevant, just because of the nature of in which the world is working, right? And it seems just like a lot of these things haven't really, there's been very little conversation about that, because there's a lot of reasons for that. The driver, once you go into practice, it's not so much from what we talk to with firm owners, it's not so much profitability. It's really just sustaining, right? I mean, a lot of reasons why, like when you decide to start your own firm, there's a lot of difference for that. You want to enact change on your own terms is one that a lot of people have, right? They just want to see their designs out in the world and have ownership and control over that, which is very different from like the only just profitability. It's just like, how do you maintain a lifestyle and be able to keep the lights on while doing it? And a lot of the firms that we see and talk to kind of come from that aspect. But I feel like this thread here about change is really like, it's a mindset shift that we've also talked to in some of the previous events, especially with Marjan Pearson, about the idea of like changes as a constant. But I'm curious to hear from others too about, just riffing off of what Shannon said. Like, do you feel very similarly to that? Like what she's describing? How does that resonate with you?
Yeah, that definitely resonates with me a lot. I like the point that you made of how fast the iterative cycles of the world are, how fast things are changing. And, I think professions in general, different professions have an issue keeping up with that. But architecture, it seems exacerbated in a lot of ways. Architecture has real issues with keeping up with the change going on in the world. And that's by no means a new issue. I mean, the Boyer report came out in 1996, so it's coming up on 30 years ago. And that report talked about this big gap between the profession of architecture and architectural education and how we can close that. So, part of it has to do with the educators that we're bringing into architectural education. Are we bringing in professionals, or are we bringing in, professional educators? Both are valuable, but both are needed. Architecture is slow to keep up with the changes in the world. Yep, that's very, very true. And in many ways, the profession keeps up a little better with the world than education does, but it still doesn't keep up as well as it should. So how do we change that? There's definitely not a direct answer, but it starts with education. In my mind, it starts with policy changes in education, cultural changes in education, and again, the people that we're bringing in to educate, and how those educators are collaborating with current professionals. If we're like Shannon and everybody else was talking about, and Nick, if we're not teaching Revit in school, if we're discouraging Revit, then architectural education is meaningless suddenly, because that's what we're using in the profession. If we're only teaching Rhino and we're not using Rhino in the profession, then what you just did for the past 3 years learning Rhino was meaningless. So that's a really difficult question to answer. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on that, but it's really pressing concern for all of us, and it needs to change quickly.
Yeah.
There's an agreement. Well, that's good. I think we settled that. Unless Shannon, you have something to add?
No, I was just gonna say, I think I saw Nick had unmuted as well, so I didn't want to cut him off. What's it called? I think there's also a bit of reciprocity in education that if we're bringing in those educators, as Scott said, there needs to continue to be education of the educators and the professionals, because once you just enter the field of practice, or you enter professorship, the world doesn't stop turning, as we said. So making sure that they are learning just as much as we are, so they can pass on the knowledge and keep up with what's going on, and also feel empowered to learn from their own students and emerging professionals in their firm. If we're talking about being in a firm with different levels of architects, which of course you are, there are. So I think that's also an extremely important point in that realm.
All I was going to add basically is I think, yes, I think in a lot of ways, education will help push, I guess, our profession forward. But we also have to remember that it's, the firms that we work for as well, some may be equipped to make those changes happen, and some of them may not be able to make such changes happen at all. And so it's a little bit of both. I would say a lot of the education is really important, but also just educating, like Shannon said, educating pretty much everyone on what's changing in the world and kind of how we can roll with the punches as they come.
Yeah, I mean, I do think like there is a lot of responsibilities that firms need to take as well, and part of it is the reality that it's almost like when you work in. I wish there was I was like interested in diagrams, like a diagram that kind of shows how fast the world is turning, how working in firms slows down time, because the reality is that like the things that you're working on take time to put together. And then in school, it feels like there's no time, because time is now an abstract thing, right? It's now it doesn't exist anymore, or it's just kind of like it's all kind of its own pressure cooker. But at the end of the day, it's on firm leaders to try to kind of bridge the gap, because they do sit in between both the next generation that's upcoming and the realities of the world. And it's not so much to expect that, there has to be some stewardship on that front of being able to come and say, and like invest in the next generation and figure out the ways in which they're learning most effectively to continue that growth internally. So it's I do think that you all make great points about how like certain changes in education need to happen, but it's kind of like there's these main cultural shifts that need to happen throughout even from school, from academia, all the way through to practice. And I'm curious then, like for those that have yet to start working at firms, what are you looking for from that firm that you're going to apply to?
I can start out with that, or Shannon,
Yeah.
if you'd like. Yeah, so one of my favorite questions to ask firms is, how does your team stay up to date on current innovations in the profession? Whether that's related to the types of projects you do, the types of software you use, or just general social considerations that you're working with in your projects. And I've experienced that a lot of times, perfectly candidly, the person I'm talking to will say, well, that's kind of where the new grad comes in. And we need that lens into education to really understand what's, first of all, what's being taught, but what other new innovations are happening. And I think that's a perfectly valid answer. Like, of course, you source talent to learn things. But that does make me question, like, what are the other inspirations for the firm's work? And how are some other ways that the firm is pursuing innovation if they don't have this new talent coming in? Because, you know, depending on the firm size, you can't hire new grads every year. So that's just something that I've been considering.
By the way, I just have to say, Carrie, that's such a great question. We don't have to dive too in the weeds into that, but like just I mean, for anyone that is in attendance that wants to hire Carrie, you should ping her, because even that question alone is already like a sign of a really great team member. I'm curious what anyone else thinks about this topic.
Yeah, so I think I am possibly one of the only people on here that hasn't had an internship and is looking to start work at a firm entry level this coming end of the summer. And that's for a load of different reasons with the pandemic and hiring freezes. So I guess part of the things that I look for is how a firm is going to support me in my own career trajectory, even after well, not after, but during the firm, because we don't always stay at the same firm every single year. A lot of younger people move around so that they get more exposure. So a couple things I ask: one, how they'll support me towards licensure if I choose that path, how they expose you to different types of projects, if possible, unless they have one focus, which you probably know going in. And then I guess any sort of mentorship within the firm, so that mentorship is a huge part of AIAS. And so I want to make sure that any firm that I belong to kind of belongs to me as well, because I want them to be supporting me in my own journey, and mentorship is a huge part of that.
And I'll take a stab at this. So I think in a lot of ways, I think I got really lucky with my post-college job. For one thing, I'm from New Mexico, so having to move across states to Utah, where I know literally no one, was a really scary risk. But I guess when I was going through the interview process, I wanted to know, what is the culture like? Because at the end of the day, your culture in the office is it's not just a wind down on Friday. There's a lot more that goes into it. And another thing that I was really wanted to know is, what opportunities do they offer for mentoring? I think my office does a really good job of kind of allowing you to have the ability to be on every aspect of a project, not just doing details, but doing the actual schematic design, the design development, doing the construction administration. I mean, it's to be able to be a part of each of those projects from the beginning of a project to the very end of the project, I think is really important for your education, to learn how to actually do everything, and especially to log your hours to become a licensed architect later down the line. But yeah, it's something else.
Scott, curious to hear from you.
Yeah, I'll run this out. So it's funny, you asked the question, I wrote down the 3 things that I kind of see as the big touch points of what I would want to ask a firm, and everybody's already covered those 3 things. So I think we've hit it pretty well. But the first thing I would like to ask a firm is just, what programs do you use regularly? And it seems like a pretty innocent question. I think, I want to know about what programs you're using so that I can learn them or figure out if I know them. But it really speaks to how innovative the firm is and how they're focused on innovation. If I walk into a firm and say, what programs do you use regularly? And they say AutoCAD, I say, okay, see you later. That kind of thing will speak really quickly to just how ready they are to move forward with new phases of architectural innovation. And if they say something that's involving AI or whatever it is, I say, okay, I don't know anything about that, but it seems like you're really innovative, and I'm ready to learn if you're ready to teach me. So that would be my first question. And then the next 2, just like Nick said, are about culture and mentorship. So I love to ask firms what their culture looks like. And you usually get either somebody who has a pretty robust and ready to go answer, or you get somebody that's like, well, we do happy hours sometimes, things like that. And then the difference between that answer and actually walking through the firm and being able to look at what people are working on, how they're collaborating, if they're talking to each other, that kind of thing is really important to me. And lastly, just like Nick said, I like to ask them, what does your mentorship program look like? And if they don't have a mentorship program, of course, that question catches them off guard, but then you can know really quickly they're not really ready to bring on new people and teach them what they need to know. They don't have a program that's ready to go for that. So those are the three things that are really important to me, or just like Carrie said, innovation, and then culture and mentorship is what I look for.
I mean, I just have to say, the kinds of questions you're all asking, I did not ask when I was your age, and it's awesome. I just have to say, like, there's just, and I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you can trace, if any of you can trace it to sort of like where does this mindset come from because essentially one of the things that's kind of been passed down from architectural education is the idea of apprenticeship, right? That's like at the very beginning of the entire, as the industry professionalized, the apprenticeship model continued, or this idea of like sort of paying your dues, or like, oh, you should be so grateful to be working at this firm, but all that kind of perspective persisted. But what you're saying just through the questions you're asking is that has flipped. That now it seems, feel free to jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like all of you feel more empowered from your position, in the sense that like you feel like you can, and it could be the market, right? I mean, this is not 2008 right now. There is a big hiring boom within firms, but I would probably wager that even if that weren't the case, you would still be asking these questions because something has changed in your perception of where you want to spend your time. Can any of you kind of talk maybe a little bit about that, about like why are you so like not insightful, but like these questions come from a place of having a leverage, right? A position of leverage, of power in a room, to be able to say like, I'm interviewing you, you're not just interviewing me. And so I just want to maybe riff on that a little bit. Shannon, I'm curious your perspective on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of it does come from the fact that we know in this market that we have options. But the other thing is, I guess it really comes from AIAS for me, because I have networked a lot in this organization, and I've had mentors, and I've had specifically for me, like young female mentors that are emerging professionals, and they can remind me how much I am worth whenever I don't believe it. And so that's something we really try to focus on in our organization, is making sure our members value themselves. And I think that's one of the biggest shifts I'm seeing in this upcoming generation of architecture students, is that they value their time, and they don't want to be dedicating their entire life to a job. They want to live outside of the job. And I guess that's one of the things that I personally see. And I would relate that to just, again, understanding your own value in the profession. So yeah.
I think in a lot of ways, it's kind of like dating. I mean, in a very, very blunt way of saying it, but it's like you're going to be committing a chunk of your life to this said firm. It's not a little thing. It's a big deal. A lot of your experience that you're going to get from this, your livelihood. I mean, it's what gives you the opportunity to have a life outside of work. I mean, it plays a really big role in your life, and so trying to find a firm that you are vibing with, that they're going to support you on your journey to licensure. I mean, you want to find that kind of stuff. It's never easy.
How many of you want to get licensed? All four? Shannon,
Yeah. I'll mention really quickly, that's a funny question, and we talk about that in the AIAS a lot. And I do want to get licensed, but I don't want to use my license necessarily. I don't want to be a traditional architect. I want to get a license so that I can go back and teach. And I've heard perspectives like that from other students as well, that they want to get a license and then move on to something else, move on to some non-traditional path in architecture, so that they can establish themselves as a professional who knows how to design and who has those credentials, and then they can use those in other fields. So obviously we encourage students to take a traditional path in architecture and get licensed and all that stuff if they're interested in that. But licenses can also be used for other things. So I'm just going to throw that out there really quickly, that even though we might all be interested in licensure, we might not be interested in what we see as traditional architecture.
Yeah, and I can add on to that. I'm in debate, and it changes every single day. So just making sure whenever I am working to log hours, so I have the option. For me, it honestly, it's about respect and making sure that I have the freedom to do what comes with having a license, because there is an absolute benefit to it, whether like logistically with pay and respect in the field, especially for a woman. We have International Women's Day this week, so woohoo. But anyway, I would say licensure brings respect and a lot more freedom and options. And even if I don't use it, as Scott said, because I want to go into policy or research or stuff like that to help better the industry, it all relates. And so having that basis, so you know all of the areas of the design field, I feel like that makes you more qualified to then expand upon it.
How many of you want to start your own firm? No one.
I've contemplated it, and I think that's something I'm definitely interested in. And I will be keeping in the back of my mind as I enter the profession. But I think where I'm at right now, like, I don't necessarily know if I can commit to saying I'm going to start a firm in the next 10 years without really having that valuable experience.
Is there anything else that you feel you'd like, or aside from like how things are built, is there anything else that you feel like you need to learn before you're able to make that decision? Or just curious, even like in a professional practice, as an example, at the bachelor, unless it's like a 5-year degree, which maybe most of you have a 5-year degree, it's not the most robust program. So I'm just wondering, for you all, like, where do you feel like you have a lot of opportunity to grow in that you would love to learn more about?
Absolutely. Yes. I would say the business side of architecture was a non-starter of a conversation, at least at my school, unless you took a specific class or you went and got your master's at the same school. But in undergrad, and like the condensed programs, I don't know if it's as a robust of a conversation. And generally, I think, learn from your mentors. One of my mentors, she just started her own firm this year. Or last year, 2022 now. And so I would say learning from others and seeing what they're doing has been great, which is again why building your network is so important while you're young. But I think I would honestly need to take some business classes and understand more of the financial sides of running a firm first. And I don't think students have been equipped. And so I think that really does fall to firm leaders to equip younger professionals from doing that, to do that.
Yeah, I'd say pretty much the same thing. The business side of architecture is not something that I feel like I have a good education in. Mine is a 5-year degree, and I did take a practice management class and a project management class, and those were kind of the two classes that focused on how do you run a business. Those were 2 seminar classes, and I don't think that I'd be able to run a business based off of those things. So learning more about, cost management, budgeting, and all of those things would be really important to me. And the other thing, maybe a couple of things, would be just dealing with people management, being able to, present in an effective way. I don't think that's something that we're taught in architecture school. I think you walk in on day one and you design a building and they say, okay, now present it. And they don't give you any tips on how to communicate a design well, how to, convince someone that it's a good design, any of those things. I think to own a business, you have to be really good at that. You have to be able to convince people to be your client. So that would be something else that would be really important to me.
Do any of you feel, because I think part of that is like the perception of different words too. So like as an example, like in the industry we say business development, you don't say sales, even though sales is business development, and sales is probably has more of a clearer body of knowledge to look at and kind of like learn from than even business development, I'd say, does. But let's like even thinking about the word marketing. Obviously, I'm head of marketing here, so I think a lot about marketing, especially relative to the industry. And I'm curious for you all, like how, because you kind of mentioned a little bit of that, Scott, like how the bringing in work, presenting work, the industry itself since the early 1900s banned architects to market themselves, right? And it was only until the 90s where that started to change, right? How does that kind of resonate with you in any sense? Like when you're thinking about even the firms that you're looking at, what about how they present themselves impacts you, or does that, impact your decision at all?
Well, oh, sorry, Shannon, I interrupted you. I guess you could say, I mean, initially, even like when applying for jobs, I always try to do some, I guess you could say some like deep research on what does the firm do? What do they specialize in? How many people at said firm actually work there? I mean, like there's a lot of like factors you want to kind of look into before just applying for a job. There's a lot that goes into it. And I would say that in my previous job that I had, I was a construction administration intern at a school district, and I had I read a few proposals from different firms for our RFP that we sent out for a new building that we're wanting to build. And so just even looking at the kind of work that they do and just seeing their proposal in general, I mean, it says a lot about the firm and the kind of stuff that they produce too. So it's, thinking in the back of my mind, like, oh, okay, this is the kind of place that I would want to work for or whatnot. Like there's just, yeah.
Yeah, I would say that's spot on. And we all do our deep research, or at least we all should do our deep research on a firm before applying. And so I'm kind of in that phase of researching firms right now, and nothing drives me more up a wall than when the information about a firm isn't easily accessible or understandable and easily flowing. So if I go on their website and it's really hard to find out who's on their team, who's managing what, like how do they run things, that's definitely something that I take into account, because I want to make sure that people that are coming to the firm are also able to see that information, because I think that also talks about the quality of client and project that they produce, because clients have expectations to see certain things on a website, for example. The other thing I definitely look to is who makes up the firm. Is it a large group of people? Is it a small group? Is it a diverse group of people? I think that's super important to me. And then also just the areas that they focus on, and making that pretty clear. I've seen some pages on certain firms recently of like values or like ethics or our vision statements and stuff like that. And that is something that I personally value when looking at firms. Especially for me, I really want to focus on resiliency work. And so seeing specific work they're doing that's not just architecture, but like working with a city to help zone things, or running public sort of volunteer initiatives, stuff like that, I think also speaks to the culture of a firm, and that I look for that, at least doing my initial research.
I think that's a great point, Shannon. And I just want to kind of expand on that idea that more development isn't always better development. And there are so many different ways for us to be involved in the community as designers. that don't necessarily result in a building. It can be involvement in policy, it can be involvement in community organizations and nonprofits, and yeah, there are just a lot more opportunities in the professional realm.
Well, we have a couple questions here. Maybe we can kind of wrap the session up. Do you think AIS can play a role in pushing more business classes within school?
Yes. Sorry, Shannon. Yes, they can. Absolutely. We can. And I think one of the best ways to do that is kind of something we've been mentioning on and off, is just creating this community that empowers students and lets them know what their value is. And also, to me, this could kind of start even further back than architecture school, if that makes sense. So if we're communicating effectively to high schoolers and younger people what they should look for in an architecture school, that will make change in architectural education a lot faster than, pushing curriculum policy or things like that, which can, educators can be really resistant to that, especially coming from students. But if suddenly all these really talented high schoolers are going to a different school because they have great business classes, that'll change really quickly. So I think a lot of this conversation is about how we're communicating in a real sense to people who are interested in architecture before they even come to architecture school.
Something.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. So something that I have personally kind of dealt with this year, and I think Scott has as well, is talking about time again, but timelines of long-term versus short-term. In school and as students, everything feels so immediate and right now, and everything's affecting us right now. But what Scott's talking about is really a long-term like issue that we need to focus on. It's about a pipeline from younger generations to become architects and design professionals, because I think the relevancy of this profession is something that definitely needs attention right now. And so I think that's a critical point. And if business development and understanding how that can impact students is an area, then I think AIS can absolutely work towards that.
All right, my last question for everyone, just a one-word answer maybe, is on-site, hybrid, or remote? What do you feel is right for you? Nicholas,
Hybrid.
Scott,
Hybrid.
Shannon,
Hybrid.
Carrie.
Also hybrid.
You heard it here, folks. The future has spoken. Well, with that, thank you so much, Scott, Shannon, Carrie, Nicholas, for this amazing conversation. I, for one, am very comforted to know that you are the next generation coming into practice.